Good evening. Καλώς ήρθατε στην Βουλή των Σωμάτων. Welcome to the Parliament of Bodies. And I'm really happy to welcome you all for the last day of the exercise of freedom. And this will be a very polyphonic day with many, many different voices. And we hope to run all together up to around 3:30 at night. So we will have some food and some drink in between. I'm just letting you know in case that you think that you want to leave or you will be hungry or all those things. So stay with us until the end of the party tonight. And apart from many other things, I like to tell you today that an artist that was very dear to all of us, that came from the indigenous communities in Canada, died a few days ago. She was found dead in the river in Canada. Her name was Annie Potogok. And Candice Hopkins wrote a little text for her that Jael will be reading now.
Annie Potogok was from Arctic, near the North Pole. Her community is called Kingate in Inuktitut, the language of Inuit people. The Cape Dorses in English. Annie passed away a few days ago. Police found her body washed up on the shores of a river that courses through the Ottawa, Canada's capital city. She was 47 years old. When Annie's drawings started to make their way to Southern audience, at first they did not know what to make of them. They were intimate and everyday at the same time. Raw, emotive, touching, sometimes erotic, tragic, and funny. They documented scenes of a family sleeping together in the summer tent with the same care and detail as a grandmother, Pistolak Ashona's glasses. The many hours Pistolak spent drawing in a room was Annie's early art education. She later picked up some of Pistolak's narrative threads, creating drawings that were personal and autobiographical at the time when the subject of much of the prints and drawings from Kinnegate were still centered on hunting, animal, camp's life, and Inuit mythologies. Through her drawings, Annie let us into her life in all of its complexities. She documented her family watching The Simpsons, listening to the weather report on the transistor radio, her boyfriend trying to hit her, the devastation of alcoholism and of suicide, as well as many singular objects, a pen and pencil, a bra, a camp stove, to name a few. Alcoholism and suicide occur in epic proportions in the North. Communities are still healing from the open wounds of colonialism and the radical severing of lives once lived in rhythm with the land. Annie achieved great acclaim in her life. Her drawing featured the Sidney Biennale and countless solo and group exhibitions across Canada. She is best known for winning the S.O.F.A.R Award, the most prestigious prize for artists under 40s in the nation. Shortly after, she was invited to be part of the Documenta 12. This inclusion made national headlines and made her community proud. Annie was always humble. She was kind and she was generous. She moved to Ottawa to start her life over again. What was meant to be a new beginning marked an untimely end. Annie struggled with the success that her practice brought. For a period, it was as though everyone wanted a piece of her, when all she wanted was to escape from this attention and from her personal demons. that always seems to follow a little too closely behind. In Arctic, there is a well-known story about a creature, half fish, half woman. She is called Sedna. Sedna was meant to meet her grave after her father tried to drown her in the ocean for marrying someone he did not approve. Despite his cruelty, he cut off her fingers one by one as she clung to the edge of his boat. She became the mother of the sea. Each of her fingers in turn grew to become the first seals and whales. I imagine that Annie now swims alongside Sedna and that they provide strength for one another.
Thank you, Jael. Maca.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Is the mic on? Okay, great. This is exercise number 27 in freedom. And my name is Macarena Gomez Barris. Macarena like the dance, but you can call me Maca. And I want to present to you bring here the Global South with me, think through a number of submerged perspectives, and really kind of unfold some of the work of some artists, filmmakers that you may or may not know. Thank you. Because it's become really important to the conversation we're having here in Documenta, the kind of cumulative conversation that's happening, I first want to locate who I am. I'm a Chilean exile who's lived in the United States many, many years. I recently moved from Los Angeles. I'm now working in New York at the Pratt Institute. I am what Licia Fiolmata calls a queer mother, and I speak to you from all of those locations. I want to think today with you about art and activisms and about research and writing into something I've been calling a decolonial queer perspective, and that's something that's going to need some unpacking, and that's what I'd like to do. Now, the reason I'm interested in queer femininities and queer indigenous femininities that I'll talk quite a bit about is because they've long embodied kind of forms of cultural memory. And the question of cultural memory, I think, is really an antidote to extractive and global capitalism today. And I want to give you some examples exactly of what I'm talking about. I found myself in kind of a decolonial queer perspective some answers to the important questions that were raised yesterday by Annie and Beth. The question that they put to us of how to make environmentalism sexy, right? There they are in the middle there. In their presentation, they suggested they don't identify with an often Eurocentric and a heteronormative idea, a bourgeois environmental movement. I agree. Even while the kind of ecosexuality movement is super powerful, I want to suggest part of the work and the genealogy that they're inserted in has long traditions in the Global South as eco-sensualities, okay? So I want to speak in parallel positions, not antithetical to, but alongside some of the work that was presented yesterday. I think part of this is that there's a way of relating to the natural world that is particular in geographies of the Global South. We can complicate the idea of the Global South. It does need to be complicated, but I want to put that forward. In particular, I'm interested in ways of thinking and being and seeing that are kind of alternative to the worlds that are visible. So I want to talk about these decolonizing visions and what decolonization may or may not mean. First, in the work of Francisco Huichequeo, a Mapuche filmmaker. Has anyone heard of Francisco's work or Huichequeo? Okay. Carolina Caicedo and some of the work that she's done in southern Colombia is someone I want to turn to next. And the work of Patricio Guzman. Perhaps you have or haven't seen the work of Patricio Guzman. I think it's much more familiar in a European context. Can you raise hands if you've seen any of that work by Patricio Guzman? Okay, great. That's very helpful. So over the past 10 years, I've been engaged in a deep process of studying cultural memory as an exercise of freedom. My work has taken me to the study of anarchist feminist movements in Bolivia, art and performance activisms in southern Colombia, ayahuasca tourism in Cusco, Peru, the southern territories of Chile, and the highly biodiverse petroleum-rich areas of eastern Ecuador, called the Yasuni, okay? From the kind of the on-the-ground work of thinking, collaborating, and embodied theorizing, I think it's really important to think of these things together, my aim has been to ponder how to decolonize memory. Part of this complex and important project, I would contend, is precisely by acknowledging the parliament of bodies that is not just assembled here in this space, but also how we situate how human and non-human life that has been disappeared sits alongside the memory of the living. Together, we inhabit a kind of over-determined space, spaces of terror, and work to reach beyond the colonial divide. This is one way to think of this work. A decolonial perspective is not only necessarily about inverting the eye of modernity, as Joaquin Torres Garcia's work brilliantly first rendered in 1940, but also about proliferating the ways we describe to and attend to the mapping of social life. So the way this takes place is through the kind of work I've done in my first book, where I considered disappearance and the question of disappearance as an important metaphor for the inauguration of neoliberalism. I described how while the US-trained Chicago boys sat in boardrooms dictating economic policies for Augusto Pinochet's violence, outside, thousands were being tortured and slain by secret police, conducting the disarticulation of socialism in detention camps. So this was before Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine came out, though she doesn't cite the work, right? We both kind of describe these acts of living in cells, the endurance of, in particular, I looked at the female body and imprisonment, and the resistant practices that long existed in relationship to authoritarianism. Part of the contradiction, of course, of authoritarianism is that it's a patriarchal, supposition. It's a patriarchal system that really legislates normative conditions for a heterosexual family. At the same time, authoritarianism cuts into the patriarchal family and makes impossible the accomplishment of that kind of form of social life, right? So in Patricio Guzman's film, Nostalgia for the Light, part of the series that I'm going to talk about, we see these searching mothers, what I would call a kind of queer image of mothers, looking for their sons and daughters and those who were disappeared, not able to accomplish their motherhood, except in this kind of irregular position, right? This queer position in these arid territories of the Atacama Desert in the northern Chile, a subjectivity produced out of state violence. In other words, my work in Where Memory Dwells was to consider how neoliberalism itself literally depended upon disappearing the parliament of bodies that had been activated by Salvador Allende's socialist-elected government. While doing research for Where Memory Dwells, I came across this image, an image that has haunted me for several years. It's of a photograph that documents the indigenous survivors of genocide during the 19th century in the occupation and pacification, an ironic name, of Araucania and the southern indigenous territories, called by Mapuche, Huiliche, and Pehuenche peoples, Walmapu. While immigration papers and land grants were freely given to German, British, and Polish settlers in the 19th century, genocidal wars forced people off their lands, dispossessed them. We often don't think then about the category of disappeared in relationship to the modern condition as an effect of coloniality, but that's in fact what I want to do by bringing forward this image, reformulating the category of disappearance and questioning and bringing into the fold the colonial past in relationship to indigenous peoples of the Americas. So I want to bring this through the work of Francisco Uchaqueo. The three filmmakers I present all deal with this question of memory in powerful ways. And what Aníbal Quijano, the Bolivian sociologist, refers to as the coloniality of power. They help us really to unpack the meaning of the Anthropocene, something I'd also like to decolonize, right, as a concept and as a process, the question of memory, the question of disappearance from the global South, and they connect us to a South project of decolonization, which I think is one of the impulses in the magazine South, the work that Documenta has been doing, to bring forward this kind of Sur perspective. So while decolonization has gained popularity as a term, I think it's become under increasing duress. We use decolonization these days for everything. Decolonize sexuality, decolonize education, decolonize, et cetera, et cetera. But from this perspective, I want to think about, is there a way to think about indigenous memory as its own side of decolonization? Can decolonization refer to everything? How do we not dilute the indigenous movements, questions of solidarities, and think about kind of land and resources and indigenous claims on land and resources as projects that are central to what we mean by decolonization? This is part of what Huachequeo is after in the Biobío region in the southern part of Chile. He is interesting, yet not widely circulated. He primarily exhibits within South American museum circuits. A film I'm going to talk about, Sidney Benoit, only has shown once in a very, very small theater in the southern territories of Wallmapu. Why I find him interesting is because we often don't think about indigeneity alongside experimentality. And he is an experimental filmmaker, thinking about sculpture, thinking about painting, how to bring kind of these subversive messages in his work that are really about a kind of experimental impulse. This film, Sidney Benoit, is a 38-minute documentary. It really echoes and thinks about questions of the ancestors coming and breaking into the sound drop, thinking about the hauntings of kind of colonial violences, warns against the continuation of the extractive capitalism, especially in relationship to pine and eucalyptus monoculture, the ancestral tree, who Mapuche think is the center of their kind of staple, their diet, the sense that the seeds provide a kind of center for indigenous life there, have been cut down, and instead we see row and row of pine tree plantations. This is what you mostly see, an immersive view that's unclear, a confusing soundtrack. What I've come to understand is that the film is really imitating and understanding the confusion between worlds, between this world, the next world, what he calls the Permentun, the kind of dream world that we're constantly oscillating between. What's going on currently in Chile is you have like a small, if you know the Izalén case, obviously in Chiapas, it's like a small Chiapas, where land defenders are primarily indigenous peoples, and you have these kinds of highly militarized scenes. But what makes the film really important is not only the documentation of these more realer aspects, but a kind of surreal element that brings forward the ways in which we're used to seeing images as stereotypes of indigenous people, the angry militant Indians question, the passive female native is question, and the non-sexual kind of indigenous other. So part of the work he does is to really immerse us into these worlds. You might have to hit play for this. And to center the protagonism of the Maule River, where it's not just a side note, but actually really center the kind of eco-sensuality and eco-sensibility that's there. You'll see in a second as the ways in which the machi comes into the center of the frame and begins to be part of a kind of sacred space that she creates. But it's not just in terms of a kind of, sense of a traditional machi figure, a sacred space, but also the way she is navigating and mediating between worlds, using water in the ways in we talked about, ritualizing water, thinking about water as a central kind of metaphor for the ways in which we understand human and non-human life. The mache figure has become the center of a kind of resistance of colonial violence for much of South America and becomes a powerful symbol of the kind of colonial resistance, an assembler of the multifractal dream and its realities. In many ways, I want to think about this figure as a queer feminine figure precisely because she embodies not just a kind of Mother Earth, but really pushing back against certain kinds of stereotypes and mediations of indigenous peoples in non-normative ways. So I want to transition, when the clip ends, to the work of Carolina Caicedo. Carolina is from southern Colombia. She's a mestiza, feminist artist, a video maker, and a performer whose fundamental visual praxis is to think against epistemicide, okay? A term I really want to kind of emphasize, epistemicide. I would frame some of my own arguments in this line of thinking in a kind of notion of epistemicide. In Epistemologies of the Global South, Justice Against Epistemicide, the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos asks us to consider the ways that we might dig below the surface of Western knowledge formations to acknowledge a kind of diverse knowledges and modes of being. Epistemicide, or the killing of heterogeneous knowledge formations, is another form of disappearance I want to suggest. So to work against the logic of epistemicide, I think we have to acknowledge these emergent social and ecological worlds. In this sense, the filmmaking praxis and the geochoreographies of mestiza Colombian filmmaker Carolina Caicedo seems pretty central to me. Caicedo takes satellite maps of extractive zones of a hydroelectric area, in this case a hydroelectric damming of a 30-mile stretch of the Magdalena River in southern Colombia, and she blows them up. Since the long tail end of the Civil War and the experience of collective violence in the Cauca region of southern Colombia, the area also continues to be highly militarized. The Spanish company Endesa has worked to eradicate the communities of indigenous and mestiza fisherwomen and men who have for centuries lived alongside the Magdalena River. So, thinking differently here about region, the communities are oriented around the river, around the long river as aquatic communities, ribera communities, communities that engage with the water constantly, not as a kind of one-off ritual, but as a constant engagement. In Caicedo's 2014 film, Yuma, Land of Friends, she plays with scale, from the mosquito on folded hands to the insertion of satellite images to find a visual kind of cues and worlds that are submerged. These are forms of engaging and layering and thinking and having us think about the questions of historical memory as well. Let's see if we can see just the short clip of Land of Friends.
Yo no tengo ninguna idea romántica de cómo era el pasado. Las cosas no estaban perfectas. La tierra quizás no se usó de la mejor manera. Pero en sí eso no de ninguna manera es razón ni lógica de sepultar todo el territorio.
El 1 de abril de 1501, el español Rodrigo de Bastidas llegó a la desembocadura del río, la cual llamó Bocas de Ceniza. Lindo, ¿no? A la corriente la bautizó Río Grande de la Magdalena, por ser el día en que la Iglesia Católica celebraba la conversión de María Magdalena.
La pregunta clave es ¿por qué vienen por aquí? Entonces hay como dos grandes teorías, ¿no? La teoría para los idiotas, que es decir que vienen por aquí a salvarnos del atraso y la incivilización y la pobreza y de todo, vienen a una sola cosa, es porque aquí la tasa de ganancia es mayor que allá. No es que allá no puedan usar esos capitales productivamente y hacer ganancias con ellos, lo que pasa es que aquí ganan más. Y en la medida en que han ido logrando con la globalización que esa plata pueda entrar y salir libremente, sin los riesgos de quedarse atrancada, con mayor razón intentan venir más, porque ya ni siquiera tienen los riesgos de empantanarse aquí en medio de una huelga, una revolución o cualquier cosa.
Ella es Zoila, la mujer de los 1000 talentos. Es pescadora de la Jagua, un pueblo enclavado entre el Yuma y el Cuacuá, o río Magdalena y río Suaza. Zoila tiene 4 hijos, un nieto y muchos hijos adoptivos.
Esta después de no haber nada en la casa por no darle a la familia, uno lleva las cuchitas, les abre una rajita por aquí, le saca lo que son las vísceras y las pone a cocinar con sal y cebolla, y a veces, muchas veces lo hacen así para mejor sustancia y mejor alimento para el caldo. Y se dejan hervir por ahí 10 minutos y ya listas para comer.
Okay. Does anyone want to comment or say anything about the clip we just watched? Anything that it brought up in terms of you, something you're thinking about? Certainly not after that. Okay. I want to just make a couple of comments at first, the kind of painting over the agency of the river, the way in which Carolina Caicedo is able to trace for us where the river ran before it was extracted, right? The church you saw in the background is no longer there. That's a church that's now been buried underwater, basically submerged underwater since the dam has gone underway. The other thing that's very interesting is that she submerges the camera underwater. We no longer hear this kind of masculinist rendering, this analysis of what's going on. And she's playing very intently with sound, as well as the visual plane, but also sound becomes, the sonic becomes really key. Something I've noticed a lot with a kind of experimental mestiza indigenous artists working along this kind of vein. The last thing she does is kind of link back to the project of colonial resistance since the 15th century, right, she suggests, where again, she makes the river the protagonist. So this is part of the scene that you see after the Endesa diversion, and her perspective as a kind of fisheye episteme, or a logic that moves the camera from below, until you get this monumental moment. And this is accomplished in the film, and we didn't see that part of the clip, where she inverts the camera and shows us the frame of this earth goddess, this figure that she's doubled. And she's shown for us, you can see, you can read into it, look into it, an earth goddess, some kind of devilish being, but basically pointing out the ways in which the river itself enters back and speaks back, right, to the camera space. This is part of the way she questions human centricity and the field of vision. So even though the hydroelectric company worked to disappear these kind of many ways of local life, she's documenting them, right? There is a way where the Femme River speaks back and pierces our view and asserts itself as an inverted view, perverting our gaze. So you can see here I'm not talking about queer embodied subjects per se, but a different way of thinking into some of these questions. In my final example, and this is some of the work that a lot of the activism around the river has organized, geo-choreographies, earth choreographies, in relationship to the river. In my final example about decolonizing memory and thinking about the question of visuality, I want to think about The Pearl Button, Patricio Guzman's monumental film, an important cinematic mode, 2014, that works from a decolonial perspective and really engages us as an open-ended inquiry. He focuses on the southern tip of the global south and uses archival footage to render the histories of settlement, questions of social Darwinism, expansionism from the British perspective, about the degree to which Chile can cohere as a nation state. And this is something I've been thinking a lot since I've been here over the last 8 days in Greece, the degree to which archipelagos are even nation states, right? The land formation, its orientation to the sea, it bears more resemblance to an island, say, than a kind of nation as we understand them, with unbroken landmass. This is a powerful and important film that has much to teach us, I would suggest, about submerged perspectives, about queer bodies, and about layering of colonial violence. In a long sequence that draws from the historical footage of their archive of the British in Patagonia in 1883, Guzman says, quote, "They arrived, the colonists, the gold diggers, the military, the police, the sheep herders, the Catholic missionaries, I would add the Protestant missionaries. After living centuries with the water and the stars, the indigenous suffered an eclipse of their world," end quote. In the next sequence, the documentary focuses on visual footage of Chilean and British officials rounding up groups of indigenous peoples. And on the soundtrack, we hear Guzman say, quote, "The Chilean government supported the British and declared the native peoples were corrupt, sheep thieves, and barbaric. Many found refuge in Isla Dawson, where the central mission was stationed. But they took their language, their beliefs, and their customs," end quote. So part of the work here was of the concentration camp, right? In a particular moment of rounding up and putting thousands and thousands of indigenous people here. And then we see this image of girls being, quote unquote, trained by Protestant nuns in terms of, training them, disciplining them into the full kind of fabric, weaving them into the project of coloniality. Indeed, in this moment, indigenous Onas became literally extinct. They were slaughtered on their own territories or forcibly moved to Dawson Island. What I want to bring back into the question here is the way this was also a territory that was used by the Pinochet regime during its military conquest. So this kind of layering of modern and colonial violence again in these spaces, right? These palimpsestic layerings of certain forms of violence. And what Patricio Guzman does is point out this kind of suturing of a genocidal history and thinking again about landscapes as places filled with the mnemonic echoes. For me, part of the work that's so central here is the way in which he brings back these kinds of images of Ona peoples in relationship to their costuming, in relationship to the stars, in relationship to the way in which they embody and literally inhabit particular cosmologies that are oriented towards the night sky. One of the things that becomes very powerful is that Guzman starts to question, what are these images? Who are we to witness and become potentially complicit in our witnessing of these images? And what is it that these images tell us? And I don't know if you can see here, but these are very ungendered bodies that are kind of taken in a portrait from the British archives, where the body again literally becomes the night sky and in relationship to the sea. That to me becomes really, really powerful as a kind of decolonial queer way to think about this. These are images of painted, whitened earth and dozens of images of Ona naked bodies. And again, the question, are we becoming the ethnographer by viewing with him these images? And what does it mean to decolonize our view precisely by thinking about this kind of question, right? So the ways in which disappearance also shows up in the colonial archive, the question of witnessing becomes really central here. Okay, so to move from this, I want to close with a very active and very sonic text to bring about some of the questions I've rehearsed and thought about with you today, and think about not only disappearance in the past, but kind of queer living forms of solidarity that travel across the global south, and start with the work of Ana Tijoux. So if we can bring that forward. This will be a clip from the singer and hip-hop artist Ana Tijoux, and it's made with the Palestinian singer Shadia Mansour. And both of them are working in tandem through kind of thinking about a transcultural position, right? About disappearing bodies facing colonial violence. But they do it, I think, in a really, really different way. Okay, so I just wanted to end with that video because it speaks so much the kind of global solidarities. It brings forth Andean cultural memory. It thinks about the kind of instrumentalities, the musicalities, the rhythms, right, of the Andean spaces, but alongside a kind of Arab vocalities, the complexity of Arab sound, and the kind of transcultural mixing that happens to evoke something that I think is really important to consider. These voices, these sounds, Somos Sur, we are the South. Thank you.